now for his insight on the influence idols had on pop culture, on television in general. On the line is Jeff McCall, professor of media studies at DePauw University, and we've reached him this morning in Greencastle, Indiana. Professor, good morning.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
It all started back in 2002. It didn't seem like an obvious hit. How do you explain its success?
I'm not sure Fox Television knew it was going to be a hit either because it was a replacement show. But I think a couple things about this show that are really important. One is this show caught fire. It developed great ratings, and it put Fox Television in competition with the other big three American networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and it became the tentpole pretty much for all of Fox Television primetime shows because during American Idol, of course, they could cross-promote the other shows that were on Fox TV. And American Idol, in combination with Fox getting a contract to broadcast the National Football League, made them serious competitors with the other three major networks. And so instead of just having the big three, we ended up with the big four. But I think this show, caught on with the audience around the country because the average viewer, I think, had a fascination that everyday people could get a shot at being on television. And I think sitting in their living rooms, they could look out there and see performers on American Idol and say, hey, these are not the glitterati of Hollywood. These are people like we might see at our community playhouse or somebody that we might see singing at our church or something like that. And I think part of the appeal of the show and part of its charm was that many of the performers were not perfect, and that you could look up there and say, yeah, these people are pretty good performers. They're not necessarily perfect, but it's nice to see them getting a shot and getting their day in the sun.
It started in England first, did it not?
That's right. Yeah, this is an import. And this, one of the criticisms I have of most broadcast primetime television is that there are no new ideas. And in fact, this was not a brand new idea in itself because it came over from England. But also, you could even look back into the very early days of television in the 50s and 60s. There were a couple of performing shows where, like, for example, Ted Mack's original Amateur Hour, where every day people got a chance to perform. That goes way back.
Yeah.
Now, none of those people continued on. They had one-shot appearances. But it still shows that there was a time when we had more regular everyday people on TV. And I think that's one of the fascinations of this show, is that audiences could resonate with those folks, and they wanted to support them. They wanted to empathize with them. Sometimes even when Simon would be tearing them down, we'd still want to feel sorry for them and feel like we could support them as everyday people.
Since you mentioned Simon, in the early years, the show was known in part for Simon Cowell's judging and cutting takedowns of performances like this one.
When you started to sing, the first thing that went through my mind was, you sound like someone who should be singing on a cruise ship. And then halfway through the song, I imagined the ship sinking.
How would you say the overall tone of the judging has evolved over the years?
Well, nobody could do Simon like Simon. And in fact, when he decided to leave the show, I think that's one of the things that signaled that this show was, heading toward its end. Because nobody really wanted to show up and be that judge who came in and, remove people or cut people down. Interestingly, I think that was part of the show's shtick, so to speak, in that he was, the bad guy, but then you had other judges like Paula Abdul who could always find an empathetic comment to make or try to support people, sometimes even after Simon had cut people down. But once they started the rotating judges, we had a revolving door there, and for the last several years of judges coming and going, and Steven Tyler never really worked out. Ellen DeGeneres was a judge for a year. But once they kind of lost the big three judging panel, I think the show was headed toward its end. And that's not to say it didn't have a great run, because it did. For 15 years, that's a long run in primetime television. And, it had 8 or 9 years where it was either first or second in the national rankings every year. And that's pretty remarkable because in the history of primetime television, you don't see that very often.
Well, as an academic, let's look at it now if we can. Idol led the surge, if you will, in reality television shows in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. Since then we've had Survivor and You Think You Can Dance, and The Voice came afterwards. So how would you characterize the show's influence on that whole genre of television? Well,
certainly it helped convince network executives that unscripted television can make it, and also that unscripted television can be relevant, and that network TV can be relevant. And the fact that these shows are done live allows for them to get audiences in real time, which is a real challenge in this day and age because most people do adjusted time viewing. And the other thing I think we can say about this show culturally is that, in its heyday, it was getting 36, 37 million viewers a week. But beyond that, everybody pretty much knew that this show existed. So beyond the people who watched it every week, with the cross-promotion and with the news coverage and the newspaper coverage, you could go to the water cooler and still know that this show existed. And in that regard, I think it's nice because I like that television can, when it's done well, can provide common cultural experiences. And we have very few of those anymore. And in fact, except for the Super Bowl here in the United States, there isn't anything right now on TV that you could say is a common cultural experience.
It was not without its detractors, however, who claimed it was nothing more than glorified karaoke.
True.
How do you think it had an influence on popular music?
I'm not sure it had a great influence on popular music. There were some performers that emerged from the show and went on to, separate careers, Jennifer Hudson, Carrie Underwood, Kelly Clarkson. But I don't think this was as much a music event as it was a television event. And in that regard, it was a television success, even though it didn't really make a contribution to popular music. And one of the reasons is, these people, went through the tryouts, they got their shot, they were successful, some of them, but a lot of the rest of them were not successful, and people can't even remember them now. But most people in the real pop culture musician world, they like the thought of, playing the clubs and dives, working your way up, becoming a great musician, and not just getting fame because you got on a show on TV and
paying your dues.
Your star took off.
So when you step back, Jeff, and look at it as a whole unit of 15 years, what stands out for you about this program?
Well, I think one thing is that, it did provide the common cultural experience. Another thing I think that is worth pointing out is that it provided interactivity for the people who watched, and that the people sitting in their living rooms felt like they were part of the show and that they could help vote and help decide who moved on. And we've seen that interactivity come into a lot of other of the copycat shows ever since, including Dancing with the Stars and shows like that.
Jeff, thanks for your time this morning.
Great to talk to you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Jeff McCall, professor of media studies at DePauw University. The final episode of American Idol airs tonight.